So now it's time to learn how to fill the sashing area of our quilt. Here you can see me stitching a large open spiral into the sashing area. I spiral into the design, then stitch right back out again, carefully spacing my lines so it fully fills that sashing area. This design is called Spiral Chain, and it's a pretty early design from the project. And you can see here I'm shifting my quilt around so that way I can really easily move it into this spiral. And spirals are one of those designs that you want to have a very nice fluid movement with your quilt. You want to make sure your quilt's very easy to shift around, otherwise you'll end up with a spiral that looks a little bit more like a square, because if you're suddenly hit a snag on your quilt and you can't move it, then all of a sudden you won't be able to stitch a circle. It won't end up being a nice smooth flowing line. So to stitch this design in your sashing, you really need to work on your spacing more than anything else, and that involves visualizing the spiral within your quilting area. And so you can see how I spaced this. I brought that first side of that spiral all the way out about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the sashing, and you're going to see me do that again right now. I'm taking that about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and then I bring in the other side about 1/2 an inch away from the edge, and that is leaving enough space for myself so that I can get all the way back out of the spiral, as you can see me doing right now, and stitching along the edge so that spiral is perfectly balanced and even within that 2-inch sashing. And it really just takes practice, honestly. I used to be terrible at visualizing spirals, and they were some of my least favorite things to stitch. But after a little bit of practice and stitching a whole lot of spirals, I promise you'll be able to stitch these in a variety of different places. Now, I really was kind of keeping an eye on my spacing so that way I would end up with a spiral in the center area, which if I had pieced it in I would have ended up with a cornerstone in this area, but I actually just pieced this as a strip, so there wasn't an actual pieced square here. But I created it more or less by stitching a larger spiral right in this area, and I'll also emphasize it whenever I stitch the next lines of spiral chain that run horizontally against this one. And so I'm just proceeding the exact same way, just simply stitching that large spiral and then spacing out the rest of these. You want to simply be careful about moving your quilt evenly and smoothly, and make sure to stop and give yourself more than enough time to reposition the quilt and reposition your hands before you get started stitching again. One of the biggest challenges I see for beginners getting started in free motion quilting is that they think that as soon as you hit the pedal, as soon as you start stitching, then you can't stop, and that you have to continually stitch, and you can't stop and move your hands and reposition the quilt, that you have to be constantly stitching and stitching and stitching. And that's just not true. I stop constantly in order to reposition the quilt, in order to get everything the way I want to, in order to take a drink of water, whatever reason. It's good to get into the habit of being able to start and stop without it causing any problems for your quilt. And one thing you should always keep in mind is always stop with your needle in the down position, and that will considerably help any issues with starting and stopping. So if you stop with your needle in the up position and you reposition, well, if your needle's up, you're more than likely your quilt's going to shift and you're going to pull your thread, and that would cause a thread break. So definitely be careful of that, and always stop with your needle in the down position. So now we've finished up this line of spiral chain, and this is butting up against the outer sashing area, and I'm actually going to stitch another design in that area. So here I'm going to actually stop on this side, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch along the piecing line in order to really kind of delineate one area and separate one area of the spiral chain sashing from the rest of the sashing. So now I've sped this video up and I've started back in the center again, because again we always work from the center to the outside of our quilts when we're quilting on a domestic sewing machine. I've started in the center and I've just simply linked up with that center area, pulled up my thread against that spiral, and I'm just simply spiraling my way down in order to fill that entire area. And again, I'm going to separate this sashing from the other sashing by stitching in the ditch along it. So that way you can tell there's definitely two different areas. And here's what it looks like when you finish filling your sashing with spiral chain. And now let's switch gears, and we are going to switch gears to the outer sashing area, and this is being filled with a edge to center design called Modern Art. And to stitch this design, all you have to do is simply stitch triangles off the edge of your quilting space. So what we're doing is we're just simply traveling along the edge and stitching a triangle down, and these can be any size and any shape. They want to be relatively skinny, but you want to change up how tall they are, so that way some of them are really small and don't go very far into the quilting space, and some of them stretch all the way across the center of the quilting space. And this creates a very interesting, very graphic texture of triangles in your sashing, and it's very easy to stitch. You can see how easily I'm moving from left to right along the sashing area, just simply moving the quilt as I angle it down the line. Now your corners, of course, can sometimes present a little bit of a problem, and I just stitch an extra big triangle in those areas to help take up a little bit more of the space. So now, just in case you're having a little trouble seeing what I'm doing, here's a better shot of stitching Modern Art, the one half of it, into the sashing area. And here's what it looks like when we finished only one half of Modern Art. And you know, it looks so good, you could honestly leave just one half of it done if you wanted to. Now we're going to finish filling the opposite side, and this just simply involves taking more triangles and filling them into the area so that way they kind of butt up against the first set of triangles. And you're generally moving again in the area in a left to right fashion, simply moving down that sashing. You're going to have some weird areas right here in the corners, and they're just a little awkward. Just try and fill the area as consistently as possible without getting any wiggly lines in there, because that's pretty noticeable since all the lines in here have been straight lines for triangles. And then just continue moving down the line. This is very easy because it's a very fluid movement, an easy movement. By the time you reach this outer sashing and borders of your quilt, it's really gotten a lot easier to move the quilt because most of the bulk of it is going to be being moved in one large section. You're not stitching and fighting all of the bulk right up around the quilt, around the sewing machine whenever you're stitching in the center. So it is actually a lot easier. The further closer to the edges, the further from the center, the closer to the edges that you get. So now we're going to back the angle of this video up just a little bit so that way you can see what my hands are doing, and you'll be able to see that the quilt is really in an interesting position at this point because most of the quilt is actually wanting to set in my lap because I'm working with the borders kind of up on the table, and then the bulk of the quilt is setting to the front of the table. And I really try not to let it set on my lap or anywhere except on the surface of the table. So I kind of roll it up just a little bit. I'm not actually rolling it into the machine. I'm just rolling it up so that my arms are resting on top of it. And you can see me shifting it around just a little bit occasionally. And I find that this is the best method for keeping the bulk of the quilt on top of the table and not anywhere else, because you want to make sure that the quilt is moving very evenly, very easily, and is not getting hung up by any of the areas of the table. Sometimes I'll actually even fold the quilt, and you can see me kind of shifting around and doing some different folds right here, where I actually make kind of a right angle with it and then kind of curl up that right angle. And this works wonderfully well, especially in conjunction with the Supreme slider, because the entire quilt is really easy to be moved. And here's what it looks like when you finish filling your sashing with Modern Art. Definitely don't miss out on the next part of this video series as we learn how to section quilt our borders. Check it out at freemotionquilting.blogspot.com.